Who am I? I'm Daniel Levane.
Hi everybody and welcome back to the vlog. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, and if you want to be notified every time I upload a video, click that bell right next to it. I would greatly appreciate it. So let's jump right into this week's episode, and I have to explain something to you. I had this very grandiose video planned. I had already started pulling photos and videos, and then I decided to scrap it. And let me explain why. Earlier this week, everybody knows there was a big important date that everybody celebrates. And I do too, but for a different reason. I'm talking about Valentine's Day. Now, Valentine's Day to me, growing up in a different country, in Argentina, it meant nothing. Valentine's Day to me was nothing. But February 14th was my father's birthday. And that's what it meant to me for many, many years until I moved to this country. And then there was this Valentine's Day thing, which I don't subscribe to. Fortunately, my wife doesn't either. But about 4 years ago, something happened on Valentine's Day that my wife and I do celebrate. And that happens to be the day that I became a citizen of the United States of America. That was the day that I became a naturalized citizen. And I was going to do a whole video about it, telling you what my road to it was and what it meant. And very last minute, I decided against it because the mood that this country is in currently, with all of the things that are happening, just felt like the wrong time to discuss it. There's so much anger and vitriol being thrown out there that I just don't want to invite any of that into this channel when it should be a celebration of this amazing thing that happened. So I'm gonna leave that alone. Maybe next year. Next year will be the 5-year anniversary, so maybe next year it will feel right. But we're gonna leave that alone. So by scrapping this plan pretty early on in this week, I left myself with no active plan for a video for this week. Because I've been trying to plan the videos a little bit more. Hopefully you've noticed that. So I'm scrambling. So today, I'm going to talk to you about things that make me a nerd. Things that I do that I like and that most people would consider to be nerdy. So one of the first things that comes to my mind is years ago, this was back in the 80s, the Rubik's Cube was announced. And I'm going to show you the Rubik's Cube up here. And it was a puzzle. It was a 3D puzzle. And I remember getting one as a child and thinking, oh my gosh, this is so cool. And taking a really long time to try to figure it out. And ultimately, not figuring it out, but prying it open with a screwdriver, popping all the squares out, putting them back together in the right order and screwing them in. And my dad got such a kick out of it that he used to tell his friends when they would come over, oh, my kid can solve the Rubik's Cube. And then he'd send me into the room. He'd have them break it up and he'd send me into the room and I'd come back out and solved it, but I hadn't. But my dad also found it fascinating, and he sat down with a journal and he drew it out and he, like almost like a schematic, figured out how to solve the puzzle. And I decided I'm going to do the same. So years ago now, longer than the 4 or 5 that I've been talking about, but in the 2000s, I decided I need to figure out how to solve the Rubik's Cube. And took quite a bit of time sitting down in a room, and I did. And hopefully what you've been watching right over my shoulder is me showing you that I can solve the Rubik's Cube. Now, I am by no means one of those speed solvers that you see on the internet all the time. I can't do that. But I can certainly do it within a 5-minute window, which I still think is pretty cool. And considering most people can't do it, I think it definitely qualifies as a nerdy thing that I do. Now, another thing that I think makes me a nerd is the fact that I used to collect, and I shouldn't say I used to, because I still kind of do, just not with as much fervor as I did once, but I used to collect DVDs. And at one point, at the birth of my child, which was almost 9 years ago, or I'm sorry, almost 10 years ago now, I had over 600 DVDs. Now, I've since divested myself of a lot of those DVDs because I got hooked on DVDs very early on, and maybe I'll make a whole video about my addiction to owning movies, but I had so many, and quite a few of them were just, they weren't great discs. They were certainly very early first issues with no special editions, and some of them were bad movies that I just bought because I had nothing else to buy at the time. So not particularly a great collection, but yes, at one point I had over 600 movies that I physically owned. I now buy all my movies digitally, and I have over movies on iTunes and a few on other services. So I collect movies. I enjoy movies, and you've heard me talk about that in the vlog, so that's not the surprise and certainly not what makes me a nerd. I think what makes me a nerd is that I collected them for such a long time, and I kept them in such pristine order that when I went to sell some of them, the place that I went to sell them ended up giving me more money because they were in such good shape. They genuinely, the disc looked like they had never been played, even though I watched every single movie I own multiple times. So I think that's one of the things that makes me a nerd. I say I'm a nerd because I like things like this. Things that mix two of big passions of mine. Legos, building stuff with Legos, and Ghostbusters, for example. This makes me a huge nerd, right? I own this. I built this. This was a gift for Father's Day to me. So this makes me a nerd, right? And while we're on the topic, to me, nerd, back in the 80s, before I even spoke English, I guess nerd was kind of a negative word. And even growing up in the States in the 90s, I felt that maybe nerd was not necessarily something you wanted to be. But now it's almost like it's socially acceptable. And to me, and this is a distinction that I make, nerd is somebody that is a fan of pop culture and nerds out about pop culture, whereas a geek is somebody that is really good at academia. They know a lot of trivia. They're good at that side of the scale. So what do you think? Let me know down in the comments down below. Are you a nerd or a geek, or do you invert those two? I'm not sure. So thank you so much for watching this week's vlog. I'm sorry for the truncated episode. I promise you next week we'll get back to something that's a little more polished and a little more planned. But let me know again down in those comments. Are you a nerd about anything? Do you have any big giant collections of things like movies or Star Wars toys? Let me know what you think, and I'll see you on the next one. Now, one of the other things that I think makes me